This podcast is produced by the Harwood Productions Podcast Network. To learn more about the network and to find more of our shows, visit us online at www.harwoodpodcast.com.
Hi, I'm Cindy Harris. Welcome to the Photography Guild.
This month, we're going to learn a little bit about some of the principles behind zoo and wildlife photography. Now, I don't live in an area where I have access to a lot of wildlife, so to speak, but I do live near a couple of zoos. So what I did is I took that opportunity to go and visit. Now, the zoo is really an interesting place to go and practice your photography. For one thing, if you're older and you don't have kids along with you, you can really concentrate on what you're doing, which is kind of nice. But also, you get to practice on a lot of different subjects, a lot of different lighting, and a lot of different techniques in general. So let me share some of those with you. So here are some things to consider when you're photographing at the zoo. The first one is distance, and that's the distance between you and the animal. Now, these are two shots that I took of a zebra, and the shot on the left was kind of your typical, oh yes, that's a zebra walking across its little habitat, which is fine, but I used my telephoto lens then to zoom in on that second shot and look at how I get such a much more close and intimate photograph of that zebra. So when you're photographing, keep distance in mind. If you're looking to photograph a singular animal, consider using your telephoto lens. If you're looking for wide group shots, then go ahead and use your wide angle. The next thing to remember is that these animals move. Most of them do, at least. And so because of that, you're going to want to do a couple of things. One is you want to keep both of your eyes open when you're composing the photo. Now, if you're like me, I'm always closing one eye and looking through the viewfinder with the other. It's really not that difficult to keep both eyes open, and here's why. You want to be able to see what is coming into your frame and what is going on around the animal, and that gives you a little bit more flexibility. The other thing is you want to be shooting at a fairly fast shutter speed, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But this series of photos here with the giraffe, the little baby walked up to the tree and he started to, what I thought was lean towards it. Well, actually in the third photo it shows he was scratching his neck. So I not only was using a fast shutter speed, but I also had my camera on power drive so that I could take a succession of photos so that I could capture that whole moment with that little baby giraffe. Now, another thing we have to consider is at the zoo, there was a lot of tricky lighting. And this is what I mean. Like, for example, in this photo with the lioness, she's underneath the tree. And on the right, you can see I've got all kinds of light going on. She's kind of, part of her's in shadow, part of her is in sun. She's got the filter of the tree. As it turns out, I'm standing in broad sunlight where I am. So it's kind of tricky. And so I'm going to give you a couple of techniques for how to deal with that kind of tricky lighting so that you don't get shots that are either too blown out and overexposed or too dark where you get, no image at all. Now, the other thing that goes on at the zoo is what I call the zoo factor. And if you look at this photo of the camel on the left, you see the zoo factor. Here's this little camel. He's on some, in some sort of habitat area. He's got a fence around him. There's some sort of water sprinkler thing in the middle of the pond. There's some people in the background. When you look at this photo, you think, yep, this is a camel and he is living at the zoo. Well, when you're photographing these animals, you want to get rid of the zoo factor as much as possible. So what I did is, if you see on the photo on the right of him, I was able to cut out all that extra zoo noise, so to speak, all those man-made factors for the most part, and get just him, a little bit of grass, a little bit of water, and some leaves. And it looks like a much more natural shot. So those are some of the tricky things. So let's start talking about things that actually make great photos. Now, the first thing you want to do when you come up to an exhibit is you want to ask yourself, now what is it about this animal that interests me? Well, we walked over to this little gibbon island, they called it, and at first I couldn't find any animals in this exhibit at all. And we looked way back, and the photo on the left is this little teeny gibbon, and he's just kind of hanging out there. And I thought, oh, you look so shy and everything. So I thought, I wonder if I can capture that. So with my telephoto lens, I was able to zoom in just on his face. And yeah, you can see he's got that kind of shy look about him. And that's what interested me. So try to keep that in mind. Try to find what it is about that animal that you're interested in and see if you can capture that. Now, this next suggestion can make the world of difference with your photos. It's get in close, focus on their eyes, and let them fill the frame. Now, let's look at these different photos that I took that day. On the left was a lizard. He was actually in a tank. But I was able to get right up to the glass and get right in his eye. And so I was able to really fill the frame with him. The little giraffe on the right, now I was doing a profile thing, but notice I made sure to get his eye in there as well. Now the little meerkat on the left, he just happened to turn and look straight at me, so that was a no-brainer. And this little guy on the right, he was down in this kind of cave thing, and his eyes were closed, and he just happened to open them while I was, focusing in on him, and I was able to get those big blue eyes. Well, what a difference when you can get close and get in on their eyes. Now, this next suggestion is great whether you're photographing people or animals, but look for their expressions and the funny little things that they do. Now, this little meerkat on the left was had the funniest look on his face. I couldn't believe it. It was so cute. Then I have this tiger who just looked like a domestic cat the way he was sprawled out taking a nap. And then the little giraffe on the right was so curious. And so to be able to look for those expressions and the funny things that they do is a really great thing to look at when you're photographing animals. Now, when you're at a zoo, there are going to be times when you've got cages and glass to deal with. Now, at the zoo I was at, there wasn't a lot of cages going on. If there were, I would have tried to get right up to them and try to focus through the cage if possible. But I did have some glass that I dealt with, and this little otter was behind glass in his little pool area. So what I did is I practiced by looking at different angles because I didn't want to get a reflection off the glass. So if you kind of move around and move your camera lens around, you can kind of get the least reflection as possible so that it doesn't bounce off the glass. And having said that, there are times where I like to work with the reflections and make them part of the photo. Now, this was an alligator who was just hanging out in his pool there, and I used all the reflection from the leaves and the sky above. I let it bounce right off that water, and I thought this was such an interesting photograph. It almost looks like painting the way it is. So yes, there are times you want to avoid the reflections, but I have to tell you, sometimes working with them can make for a really interesting photograph. So one of the things you should think about when you get to the zoo is find out when the feeding times are. You can see animals doing all kinds of neat things when they get a chance to interact with their food. So when I went to the zoo, the elephants were being fed at first, and so I went over there straight away, and sure enough, the handlers had put all these different branches and things out for the elephants, and then they came out and they were picking them up with their trunks and doing all kinds of crazy things with them. And then I got the shots I liked then, and then I noticed, oh, the giraffes were going to be being fed next, so I zoomed over there and was able to see this little baby giraffe picking up this branch. And I don't know if you can see, but that little kind of grayish black thing, that's his tongue. He had that thing totally wrapped around the branch. So really check out when the feeding times are. You can get some really great shots. Now, this next tip is true for all photography, but do try to vary your camera angles. Now, when I was over photographing the zebras, I was just holding my camera in its traditional, horizontal plane, and I got a fine picture. But then I decided, oh, that's right, I need to try to get some vertical shots as well, and you really can get more of the elongation of his nose because I went vertical. So really try to vary your camera angles when you're photographing the animals. It can make for a much more interesting photograph. So the other thing to keep in mind is look for a chance to use some of the other types of photography that you've learned. Now, on our last episode, we had done shadows and silhouettes. So I went into the area where they had the flying squirrels. And so I saw these little flying squirrels. They kind of look like bats, to me at least, and they're crawling around on their little wires and ropes and everything. And then all of a sudden, one of them opens its wings, and that's the shot on the right, and you can see all this silhouette and shadow and color in the wing, and I thought that was so interesting. So look for shadows and silhouettes. You never know what you might find. Now, another surprise is that I got to use some macro photography. I went into the reptile house, and the first exhibit was the one here on the left with these little teeny tiny frogs. They almost look like a little children's plastic frog toy. They were so tiny. Well, what I did is I put on my macro lens, and even though these guys were behind glass, I was able to get a good angle, and I was able to, get them a lot bigger than they were just with the naked eye. Just like the frog on the right, this guy was maybe 1/4 to 1/2 inch long. He was tiny, but because I had my macro lens, I was really able to get a nice shot of him sitting on his little branch there. So look for ways that you can use some of your other photography skills and techniques. It makes for some really interesting zoo photos. And the last tip I have is get artistic. I would have never thought that I would find an alligator to be one of my more artistic outlets, but here this guy was just having his face floating on the top of the surface, and the way the reflection of the trees and brush around him just made for this really interesting watercolory type photo, which I thought was really cool. Now, on the right, I did this close-up of this zebra's eye, and because of the amazing patterns on those animals, you first look at that and you're thinking, what is that? And then the more you look at it, you go, wow, that's his eye. So try to get artistic as well when you're looking at the different animals. Okay, so what are some of the techniques we need? Well, let's first talk about your camera. If you have a point and shoot, try to use as many of the auto features as are available to you. If you're using an SLR, you definitely want to consider using or bringing your telephoto lens with you. It's practically a must so that you can reduce the distance between you and the animals. The other thing is, if you have a macro lens, pop that in your case as well. You might be surprised how you can use that. Now, in terms of settings, this one is a little bit more in flux and fluid. I found that I was shooting at pretty high ISOs for the most part, 800 and above. And then normally I shoot in the AV or aperture mode, which means I control the aperture. But at the zoo, because the animals are in constant movement, I was shooting in the TV mode or the time value mode, where I could control my shutter speed. Now, when I was controlling the shutter speed, if the animal was outside and moving, I was shooting about 1/1600th of a second. Now, when I moved into the reptile house and I was shooting indoors, I would slow it down to 1/100th. But really, the best way is for you to take a test shot, have a peek in your viewfinder, see how it looks, and then make your adjustments. This is really the best way to handle all these tricky lighting situations, especially. Many times I would be standing sometimes in the shade, the animal was in bright sun, I'd take a shot and the animal was totally dark. So you have to really kind of shoot, then pull yourself off to the side, have a look, and then adjust accordingly. The two things that I was mainly adjusting were my ISO and my shutter speed. I just let the aperture take care of itself. Now, there are some things when you get back home that you can do in post that can also really enhance your photographs, and one is cropping. If you need to try to get a little bit more of that distance reduced between you and the animal, crop. If you're trying to do something a little artistic, use your crop feature. Also, if you're shooting in the raw format, you can adjust your exposure, and the thing that I find that I play with the most would be my black point, and if you have that available, that's a fun thing to kind of just tweak a little bit. It really enriches the colors in your photographs. So the assignment this month is either go to a zoo, or if you live in an area where you've got some cool wildlife, go and photograph them. Now, the deal when you're photographing animals at the zoo or out in the wild is you really have to take a lot of pictures. And for me, for example, when I was at the zoo, I was there for 2.5 hours, maybe 3 hours, and I clicked off over 400 photos. And I was really pleased that I did that because I was able to get and capture some of those expressions and some of those movements in the animals that if I was really limiting myself as to how many photos I took, I probably wouldn't have had such a great selection of photos to choose from. So get out there and take lots and lots of photos. Now, once you get your photos, I hope you'll share them with us because, as always, we learn so much from looking at each other's work. So feel free to go on Flickr and go to the Photography Guild and post some there. Or if you need help uploading to Flickr, you can go to our website at harwoodpodcast.com and visit the Photography Guild page. And we have a how-to tutorial that will help you get your photos on Flickr so that you can share them with the rest of the world. Well, next time I thought it would be fun to play with some landscape photography. I've had really the good fortune in these 3 photos I've been able to photograph, Lake Tahoe, Walden Pond, and even over in Europe. So I thought it would be fun going into fall. There's some beautiful fall color that's starting to happen, and let's take advantage of getting out there while the weather's mild and getting some great landscape photography shots. I'll see you next time.
For more information on this episode, go to our website and visit the Photography Guild show notes. Also, if you have any questions or ideas, send us an email. Thanks for watching.